Before Hitler seized power, Germany was a country where people lined up for kilometers just to get a bowl of thin relief soup. How, in just 6 years, did it transform itself into a military powerhouse teeming with roaring tanks and squadrons of warplanes? In the bitter winter of 1933, street corners in Berlin held large pots simmering watery relief soup, with queues stretching from one end of the street to the other. 3 out of every 10 working-age Germans depended on this meager bowl of soup to survive. Germany was a nation trapped in numbness and despair back then. No one knew if they would have a hot meal the next day, let alone imagine that Berlin would be completely transformed 6 years later. By 1939, the soup lines on those very corners had disappeared, replaced by rumbling tanks and armored vehicles. Fighter jets and bombers streaked across the sky in formation, shaking all of Europe beneath Germany's iron heel. The country's crippling 30% unemployment rate had plummeted to less than 1% in a seeming miracle, bringing full employment and a surge in national power. This was the so-called economic miracle the Nazis endlessly touted. Yet the truth was that this was no miracle at all. It was a carefully crafted hoax, a false prosperity nourished by the erosion of German civil liberties, the blood of Jewish people, and the suffering of an entire continent. Like an overstimulated star, it burned bright for a fleeting moment before collapsing and detonating, dragging Germany into an inescapable abyss. A question has lingered widely. Just how broken was Germany before the Nazis came to power? How could a fanatic, with nothing more than a few slogans, rescue a nation on the brink of collapse and turn it into a self-proclaimed great power? To unravel this mystery, we must start with the Treaty of Versailles signed after World War I, a pact branded the Death Treaty that laid the tragic foundation for Germany's fate. The Treaty of Versailles stands as the harshest and most resentment-breeding peace agreement in human history. It was never crafted to uphold peace, but rather a financial noose specially designed for Germany by the Allied powers. 3 fatal clauses pushed Germany to the brink of total collapse. First, it imposed crippling reparations payable in hard currency, equivalent to hundreds of billions of US dollars in today's value. A bottomless pit for a war ravaged Germany left in ruins. Second, territorial dismemberment severed Germany's economic lifeline. The country lost 13% of its territory, 15% of its arable land, and vital industrial hubs including the Ruhr Valley and Silesia. France and Belgium even sent troops to occupy the Ruhr, seizing Germany's economic backbone outright. Third, the confiscation of all merchant ships cut off Germany's foreign exchange earnings, blocking its only path to earning hard currency through foreign trade to settle reparations. Combined, these 3 terms left Germany in a fatal deadlock, stripped of its ability to earn foreign exchange, yet forced to keep paying reparations, import food and raw materials, and rebuild factories, draining the central bank's foreign exchange reserves. The Weimar Republic had no other option but to print money to inflate away its debts, even as it knew this would spark hyperinflation. The scale of this monetary collapse was staggering. In 1923, a glass of beer cost 100 marks in the morning and 1,000 by nightfall. The marks that would buy a house one day could only purchase a loaf of bread the next. Workers rushed to stock up on food the second they received their wages, and the mark ultimately became worthless scrap paper. People pushed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread, children used banknotes as building blocks, and even street beggars refused to accept marks. This inflationary catastrophe wiped out the lifetime savings of Germany's middle class. Pensions, insurance, and wealth accumulated over generations vanished overnight. Public trust in the government shattered completely. When people could not even secure basic food or retain their dignity, they turned away from rational voices and embraced extremist groups that offered empty promises and shouted inflammatory slogans. And so, the Nazi Party was born. The National Socialist German Workers' Party sounded noble in name, but behind its acronym Nazi lay unbridled bloodshed, violence, and fanaticism. Hitler and the Nazis offered no sophisticated economic theories. Instead, they shouted the most direct and enticing slogan to Germany's hungry and unemployed masses: Brot und Arbeit, bread and work. They indoctrinated the public into believing their suffering stemmed from the oppression of the Treaty of Versailles, exploitation by international Jewish capital, and the incompetence and weakness of the Weimar government. In an era of despair, such incendiary rhetoric acted like a devil's lure. Even the most clear-eyed Germans pinned their hopes on a strongman to break the deadlock. Ironically, newly declassified historical documents from 2026 reveal that Germany's economy was already showing signs of recovery in 1932, the year before Hitler took power. Reparations were slashed by 90% at the Lausanne Conference. The government launched public works programs, and both unemployment and inflation eased slightly. But for Germans who had endured more than a decade of hardship, these changes were too little, too late. They craved immediate, drastic transformation, even one built on lies and violence. On January 30, 1933, Hitler was officially appointed Chancellor of Germany. He inherited a nation crippled by 30% unemployment, rampant inflation, and widespread poverty. A populace so desperate that it would accept any change, and a country poised for a rebound. Hitler knew that to deliver on his promises and realize his ambition of world conquest, he needed an economic mastermind who could perform financial wizardry. Hjalmar Schacht, a banker later dubbed the Dark Wizard of international finance. Hitler granted Schacht unchecked economic authority, and Schacht used his financial alchemy to send Germany hurtling down an irreversible path to ruin. In 1933, Schacht faced a national impossible trinity, putting millions of Germans back to work, secretly rearming the military, and stabilizing inflation while preserving foreign exchange reserves. 3 mutually conflicting and immensely daunting tasks. Yet this financial sorcerer pulled off the seemingly impossible with 5 core strategies. His first tactic was a hidden money printing machine, MEFO bills. Schacht created a shell company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, MEFO for short. When the government placed orders with arms manufacturers, MEFO issued government-backed promissory notes, MEFO bills that banks were required to honor and discount. On the surface, the government printed no new currency and racked up no massive public debt, but in reality it injected huge sums of capital into the economy. According to 2026 research data, Schacht funneled tens of billions of marks into arms factories in just a few years through MEFO bills, fueling Germany's military buildup. The second strategy was a bureaucratic quota system. Schacht abandoned market regulation entirely, putting the Nazi bureaucracy in charge of resource allocation. Industries tied to rearmament received priority access to steel, cotton, and other critical materials, while civilian businesses were given minimal rations or none at all. He built a closed, war-focused economic system in Germany that completely ignored the needs of ordinary citizens. Third was selective debt default. Schacht suspended repayments on some World War I foreign debts, destroying Germany's national credit entirely. But his gamble paid off. Amid the global Great Depression of the 1930s, Britain, France, and the United States were either struggling to save themselves or unwilling to go to war with a defiant Germany over unpaid debts. He continued repaying debts to influential nations like Britain and the Netherlands to secure trade advantages, while defaulting outright on the United States, a less vital trading partner, saving vast amounts of foreign exchange in the short term. Fourth was strict import controls. Schacht mandated that businesses obtain government approval to import foreign goods, with the sole criterion for approval being whether the goods supported rearmament. Materials for gun barrels, aircraft engines, and other military hardware were greenlit. Luxury goods were rejected outright. Every penny of foreign exchange was funneled into arms production. Fifth was the plunder of Jewish property. While the Nazis politically persecuted and demonized Jews, Schacht recognized that Jewish communities held enormous wealth, and if Jews fled Germany with hard currency, the country's foreign exchange reserves would dry up overnight. He enacted laws restricting capital outflows, leaving Jews with two brutal choices: flee Germany penniless or stay and face genocide. The stolen wealth was directly converted into Nazi weapons. Together, these 5 strategies fundamentally reshaped Germany's economy. It appeared capitalist on the surface, but its economic system was tightly controlled by Schacht and Nazi bureaucrats, with its direction dictated entirely by Hitler. Admittedly, Schacht did deliver a miracle on paper. Unemployment fell from 30% to under 1%, and Germany's GDP rose from $81.4 billion in 1933 to $90.6 billion in 1939, an average annual growth rate of 7.87%. But this was a devil's bargain, paid for with the loss of civil liberties, stagnant living standards, and the lives and fortunes of Jewish people. 2026 research shows that between 1933 and 1939, German workers' nominal weekly income rose by 19%, but this growth came almost entirely from longer working hours. Hourly wages remained stuck at Depression-era lows. Though Germans had jobs, their quality of life never truly improved. Daily necessities grew scarce, with food and clothing rationed. The promise of bread and work was nothing more than a tool for the Nazis to control the population. By 1936, Schacht recognized the looming crisis and advocated slowing the pace to normalize the economy. He knew that relying on military expansion, hidden money printing, and plunder could never sustain long-term stability, and that continuing down this path would trigger even worse inflation and catastrophe. But Hitler refused categorically. He sought not steady growth, but world conquest, sparking a bitter rift between the two men. That year, Germany stood at a crossroads. Schacht tried to nurse the economy back to health, while Hitler forced the ailing nation into a war marathon, sealing its fate of destruction. In 1936, Hitler launched the 4-year plan, a blunt and ruthless initiative, to ready the military for full-scale war within 4 years, achieve near economic self-sufficiency, and secure supplies of oil, rubber, steel, and other strategic materials. He never forgot Germany's defeat in World War I, caused in part by a crippling shortage of strategic resources. The plan was not entrusted to Schacht, but to Hermann Göring, the Nazi second-in-command, an ignorant, boastful, and corrupt figure with no understanding of economics whatsoever. Upon taking office, Göring faced a critical problem. Germany's domestic iron ore was low-grade and costly to refine. Yet Hitler demanded self-sufficiency using only domestic ore. Established steel industrialists pushed back fiercely, but Göring responded with brute force. If you will not do it, the state will. He founded a massive state-owned conglomerate, the Hermann Göring Works, putting the state directly in charge of mining and steel production, and squeezing private enterprises out of the market entirely. Germany's economy morphed into a state-monopolized war economy, with the state dictating rules, competing directly, and eliminating private business. Watching this unfold, Schacht descended into despair. He repeatedly warned Hitler and Göring that their policies would spark inflation far worse than the 1923 catastrophe. But Hitler was consumed by his conquest fantasies and ignored the warnings entirely. In 1937, Schacht was dismissed as Minister of Economic Affairs, and a few years later lost his post as President of the Reichsbank. Germany's economic brakes were fully removed. Göring's 4-year plan acted like a runaway engine, pushing Germany's economy deeper into collapse. Costly projects for synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel plants drained Schacht's financial alchemy dry, leaving funds and resources in critically short supply. With domestic resources exhausted, Germany turned to external plunder. An economy unable to sustain itself through internal circulation was destined to expand aggressively, and the Nazi economy devolved into a predatory, carnivorous economy. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria, looting its gold reserves, foreign exchange, banks, and factories. In September 1938, it seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and by 1939 occupied the entire country, seizing the Škoda Works, Europe's most advanced arms manufacturer. The twisted, self-reinforcing logic of the Nazi economy was now laid bare. Rearmament drove breakneck economic growth, which demanded massive capital and resources that drained domestic reserves. To replenish those reserves, Germany had to invade and plunder other nations. Expansion required even more arms, which consumed still more resources. War was no accident. It was the inevitable outcome of this deformed economic system, not a whim of Hitler's, but a conflict the economic machine forced Germany to wage. The Nazi economic miracle revealed its true face. Not a path to prosperity, but a one-way street ending only in war and annihilation. On September 4, 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland, and the Nazi war machine bared its fangs, making Poland its first official victim. In the early stages of the war, victories seemed to validate the Nazi miracle. Poland fell in just 1 month. In the spring of 1940, German forces bypassed the Maginot Line and defeated France, hailed as Europe's strongest army, with blitzkrieg, shocking the world. This victory unleashed an unprecedented looting spree for the Nazis. Gold from France's national treasury was shipped to Berlin. French factories were either dismantled and their machinery sent to Germany or forced to produce for the Reich. Trucks and horses were seized by force. French civilians' rations were cut, and resources flowed ceaselessly to Germany to prop up its domestic supply. Historical records show that occupying France alone netted Germany the equivalent of tens of billions of euros in today's currency every month, drastically easing its fiscal strain. In the summer of 1940, German citizens barely noticed a drop in living standards. The front lines saw unbroken victories, and the home front was supplied with plundered resources from across Europe. It all seemed too good to be true. Hitler even predicted Britain would sue for peace after France's surrender, allowing him to consolidate his rule with looted wealth and expand further. This was the allure of the blitzkrieg economic model, using quick, short wars to fund themselves with spoils and even turn a profit. But history refused to bend to Hitler's madness. Britain refused to surrender. Winston Churchill delivered rousing speeches rallying the nation to fight to the end, and the Battle of Britain began. The German Luftwaffe suffered its first major defeat in a swift campaign, and Operation Sea Lion was abandoned for good. More fatally, Hitler had long fixed his gaze eastward, obsessed with seizing vast Lebensraum, living space on the Russian plains. He viewed defeating France as merely clearing a Western obstacle, with the real decisive battle waiting in the east. On June 26, 1941, Hitler tore up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, deploying 3 million troops in a massive blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union. This time, the Nazi war machine hit an impenetrable wall: ice and snow, mud, endless expanses of land, and the unyielding will of the Soviet people. Blitzkrieg relied on rapid encirclement to cripple enemy command centers, but the Soviet Union's sheer size defied Hitler's wildest imagination. German tanks drove hundreds of kilometers without reaching the edge of Soviet territory, and soldiers marched for months without nearing the Soviet heartland. The Soviet winter proved even more deadly. Temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees froze Germany's precision weapons into useless scrap metal. Soldiers in thin uniforms struggled to survive in the ice and snow, with more dying or suffering frostbite than in combat. Hitler had planned to end the war against the Soviet Union within months, so soldiers could return home for Christmas. A naive fantasy that quickly turned into a nightmare. Crucially, the Soviet Union's war mobilization exceeded all expectations. Stalin turned the entire USSR into a giant arms factory with ruthless efficiency. For every factory occupied, 10 new ones were built east of the Ural Mountains. For every division destroyed, 10 new divisions were mobilized in Siberia. The war quickly devolved into a total war of attrition, fighting over manpower, resources, and population, precisely the scenario Germany's predatory economy could never withstand. The Eastern Front became a massive meat grinder devouring German manpower and material. By late 1941, German forces suffered their first major defeat outside Moscow, leaving hundreds of thousands of elite troops and military hardware frozen in the Russian snow. When news reached Berlin, Nazi leaders panicked, and ordinary Germans felt the harsh reality of war for the first time. Casualty notices flooded in, store shelves emptied, rations were cut repeatedly, and the once promised bread and work became a distant dream. The Nazi economy faced its first severe crisis. It was then that Albert Speer stepped into the fray. Hitler's chief architect, a technocrat with artistic sensibilities and sharp professional expertise, Speer was unexpectedly appointed to oversee all arms production in early 1942, after the incumbent war minister died in a plane crash. The appointment seemed baffling at the time, but it proved one of Hitler's few correct wartime decisions. Speer approached the role like a modern corporate CEO, implementing rational reforms with basic management principles. No magical fixes, just sound organization that created the Speer production miracle. Speer's first reform was integrating resources to end internal waste. At the time, Germany's Army, Navy, and Air Force operated independently, producing identical parts with separate specifications, driving up costs and crippling efficiency. Speer forced the merger of the three branches' procurement and production departments, establishing specialized committees to coordinate weapons manufacturing. For instance, the head of Porsche led a tank committee to unify tank production standards. His second reform was standardized production. Before the overhaul, a single German machine gun required hundreds of unique parts, which could only be repaired at the original factory if damaged. Speer mandated simplified designs and uniform standards, allowing mass production of interchangeable parts across factories. Frontline soldiers could assemble and repair weapons on the spot, drastically improving equipment utilization. Third was specialized division of labor. Speer ended the absurdity of watch factories making artillery fuses and piano factories manufacturing aircraft parts, instead having each factory focus on its core expertise. Assembly line production pushed efficiency to its absolute limit. The results were staggering. 2026 statistics show that between 1942 and mid-1944, German arms production exploded. Annual tank output quadrupled from under 3,000 to over 12,000. Fighter plane production quintupled from 8,000 to over 40,000. Yet this miracle could not save Nazi Germany. It came far too late, and Speer faced two unbeatable enemies. The first was the bottomless black hole of the Eastern Front. For every 3 Tiger tanks Speer's factories produced, 4 were lost on the Eastern Front, with additional losses to Soviet partisan attacks on supply convoys. No amount of production efficiency could keep up with the front's insatiable attrition. The vast gap in manpower and resources between Germany and the Soviet Union was insurmountable through reform alone. The second enemy was the Allied strategic bombing campaign. Starting in 1943, thousands of British and American heavy bombers launched relentless raids on German soil, targeting the heart of the Nazi war machine. Ruhr Valley ball-bearing factories were flattened, leaving tanks, planes, and submarines useless without critical components. Synthetic fuel plants were repeatedly bombed, draining the Wehrmacht's lifeblood. Rail hubs, bridges, and canals across Germany were destroyed, cutting vital supply lines. Shells from the Ruhr could not reach the Eastern Front, and Romanian oil could not reach airfields. Speer worked tirelessly to rebuild bombed factories and relocate production underground or into caves, but all efforts were in vain. Allied bombing grew more frequent and intense, and German military-industrial production collapsed step by step. Starting in 1943, thousands of British and American heavy bombers launched relentless raids on German soil, targeting the heart of the Nazi war machine. Ruhr Valley ball-bearing factories were flattened, leaving tanks, planes, and submarines useless without critical components. Synthetic fuel plants were repeatedly bombed, draining the Wehrmacht's lifeblood. Rail hubs, bridges, and canals across Germany were destroyed, cutting vital supply lines. Shells from the Ruhr could not reach the Eastern Front, and Romanian oil could not reach airfields. Speer worked tirelessly to rebuild bombed factories and relocate production underground or into caves, but all efforts were in vain. Allied bombing grew more frequent and intense, and German military-industrial production collapsed step by step. By late 1944, Germany's economy was not merely in recession, it had completely disintegrated. Currency became worthless once again, with inflation soaring to the catastrophic levels of the 1923 hyperinflation. On the black market, people reverted to bartering with cigarettes, canned goods, and clothing, reducing Germany's economy to a primitive system of exchange. To the question of whether Nazi Germany's defeat stemmed from its flawed economy, yes, and not entirely. It is true because the Nazi economy was a deformed system built on fundamental miscalculations. A mid-sized power with scarce resources, it attempted to use a stimulant-fueled predatory economy to take on the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain, nations with vastly greater industrial output. Economically, the war was doomed from the very start. Schacht's financial miracle prolonged the fight by a few rounds, and Speer's production miracle injected brief vitality into a crumbling regime, but neither could alter the final outcome. It is not entirely true because economic collapse and military defeat fed into each other, creating an inescapable death spiral. Economic collapse crippled arms production, leaving frontline soldiers short of weapons and supplies and eroding combat effectiveness. Military defeats cost Germany its occupied territories, reducing the flow of plundered resources and further crippling the domestic economy. In the end, the Nazi economy did not merely fail, it vanished entirely. Like an overstimulated star, it burned bright for a moment before collapsing and detonating, dragging Germany and tens of millions of people into total annihilation. Looking back at this so-called economic miracle, it began with Hitler's promise of bread and work, and ended in hunger, rubble, and the deaths of tens of millions. It was never a miracle, but a cautionary tale of arrogance, fanaticism, and ruin. Some claim this history is outdated and irrelevant to the present day, but history's greatest purpose is to warn, not to be forgotten. The Nazi economic miracle delivers a vital lesson. Any false prosperity built on lies, tyranny, plunder, and the sacrifice of people's freedom and dignity is destined to collapse. Any fanatical ideology that uses war as an engine for economic growth only brings endless suffering to humanity. We recount this history not to rehash war or condemn individuals, but to ensure such a miracle never happens again. True economic miracles are never forged with tanks and guns, or built on plunder and slaughter. They are created through hard work, ingenuity, fairness, and justice, built steadily one step at a time. Only such prosperity is real. Only such nations can truly be strong and endure.